welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a graduate student in education, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Part of the act of philosophizing is looking at typical things in atypical ways in order to deconstruct what they are and what they mean. Have you ever seen an enormous dog meekly obey a small owner? Have you ever looked at your money and wondered what gave it value? Have you ever listened to a philosophy podcast and wondered where they got their information and if it's accurate? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then you've questioned authority. While that phrase may hold negative connotations elsewhere, it is the cornerstone of what we're trying to do here. All right, so authority. I think this one's going to be a bit of an interesting topic because it sort of applies to all parts of our life, right? You can't really talk about much of anything without trying to determine where the source of the authority comes from. So what is authority? How would we define it?
Well, I'm thinking of all the multitude of different things to which it refers. I mean, for me, as an academic and someone who has seen this being shredded across our culture, authority refers to knowledge. It refers to the accuracy of what is known at any particular time, which is not to say that knowledge can't change. Of course it does. So science has authority, but we know that science is both inductive and deductive, but often inductive, which means that a conclusion is probably going to be right until new information comes in. Or it is right until a new information comes in. So there's an authority of knowledge. So we would talk about a doctor's authority. We want a doctor to know certain things. Otherwise, why would we go to a doctor? Well, we have people backing away from trusting medical knowledge now, which is devastating potentially to the entire planet. All right, then we have political authority. And social authority. Political authority having to do with who leads a state, as in a government. Social authority as in who creates the rules, who enforces the rules, and why are those rules assumed to be set in stone when in fact life changes. So there's all kinds of levels. There's phenomenological authority. You encounter something in the outside world. We talked about this last week. How we encounter it. Does that exist? But let's assume that it does for a moment. How do you encounter that? What is the authority of that experience? If I see a Letchworth Park gorge, I'm going to have a reaction to it, even if I've seen it before. But the fact of that gorge existing is set literally in stone, except that the stone keeps shifting and the shale keeps falling. And so the authority shifts.
Right. Yeah, that last one's real interesting. And I'm sure we'll circle back to that by the end of the episode. Those first two, that's kind of the big question of authority in philosophy, right? Is sort of theoretical authority versus practical authority. And what's funny to me about that is that, reading and doing research for the show, They seem to attempt to draw a distinction between them. And I'm wondering why. Like you have, all right, theoretical authority, that's kind of what you were talking about with doctors and teachers and this sort of thing. People who have spent a good amount of their lives dedicated to a certain field, learning certain knowledge. And so they're looked at as able to dispense advice for individuals, but they're not really looked at as able to influence people's actions. And then you have practical authority, which is associated with the political realm, where they're not going at a theoretical level. They're not giving you advice. They're saying, okay, you must act this way, or you can be punished, or if you act this way, we can give you some sort of incentive. It's carrot and stick sort of thing, right?
Yes, behavioral.
Why do you think it is that the field of philosophy has developed this distinction as opposed to saying the people who are theoretically authoritative should have some role in practical authority?
Well, I think that the theoretical does have a practical role. It's, theoretically, doctors have knowledge. In practical terms, surgeons have knowledge. You don't want to put a scalpel in my hand unless I'm working at paper art. Okay, but I don't want somebody who works on paper art and has never worked on a body to open me up, and so there's a practical application of hard earned familiarity with knowledge. And I think it's philosophically rooted, whether it's in, it goes back to Aristotle, it goes to Plato, the authority of the leader, to Aristotle, or the state, to Aristotle's the authority of the leader, Plato's the authority of the state, and so on, all up through Hegel, which is the authority of experience, and the dialectic. It deals with epistemology, which we've talked about before, which is how do we know that which we know? How do we come to knowledge? It deals with the ontological, which is what is it that exists? If we assume an authority, like there's a philosopher, Coelho, who more recent in the 20th century, who divided authority discussions into four parts, and one of them was theological, the father-based authority, and that is, and then so in the medieval era, so to speak, God had complete authority. And so there was that punitive thing. There was that you don't push back. You just do what you're told to do by the book and by the people who have the authority of the book, so to speak. There's the authority of the leader, which is much more political. There's the authority of the judge, who, as this philosopher points out, wouldn't even be necessary if justice existed in the other kinds of authority, but it often doesn't. So that's why philosophy couldn't help but talk about it, because it touches on all of the separate categories or realms within philosophy.
Okay. So we have the various ocracies, right? We have theocracies and meritocracies and,
Yes.
and all these different types of things that are, now those are systems of government based around a certain type of authority. But generally what you just said was that usually several different types of authority exist within a form of government, regardless.
Yeah.
Why is authority necessary?
Well, I'm not going to try to put it into a hierarchy, but I mentioned some things, and I want you to bounce back with this, because without the authority of knowledge, you have people blindly moving about in a universe which, for the most part, we can't understand. It is the authority of probing, experiment, and theory which takes us to a place where we understand more things around ourselves, even as that understanding changes. Lack of authority creates a false sense of complete knowledge. And we have seen that in our culture across these recent years, where people refused to accept the authority of doctors because they don't like what they're saying. So they want to get a second opinion. Well, they get a second opinion from somebody who knows nothing about what they're talking about, but I like the way that sounds, so that's what I'm going to go with. So it's the authority of agreeing with you rather than the authority of the factuality of things that have happened. And we dissociate from that. It's very interesting, and I'm not. This is not a politicization to say this. This past week, the Dr. Francis Collins, who's in charge of the NIH, who was in charge of the Human Genome Project, who at one point was an atheist and became an evangelical Christian, and then Dr. Fauci, they talk to each other daily. Well, NPR brought them together to have a conversation. They asked them what was the most stunning thing for them in this first year of the pandemic. And both of them said that they are still deeply troubled. We're absolutely, essentially blown away by the disconnect people have from reality and factuality. And so the disconnect from listening to and being guided by knowledge. That is a devastating thing, and we have not emerged from that, and I'm not entirely sure we can. I'd like to be optimistic, but I'm not sure.
What do you think the root cause of that is?
Well, I think there are plentiful causes, but one of them is not being so invested in a belief that one has that one will not even consider the sources of knowledge, saying, well, what you believe is just not quite helpful. You and I have talked about these kinds of things before, and very, very recently. So it's not that authority knows everything. It's that authority is the best, depending on the topic, the authorities in that topic are the best sources from which to work off of, to guide your thinking, not to shut your thinking down and let other people tell you what you must think, but rather to guide your thinking. But if you are so invested in a belief that you just can't possibly consider documented facts or facts that are so-called facts that weren't facts at all, have been completely debunked by sources right, left, and center, but you just can't believe that because you don't accept that that's the way the world works, then you have disconnected from reality in a sense. And if you've got a large population anywhere, a planetary population that disconnects from the sources of knowledge, then we're back to wandering around, bumping into each other, thinking we know everything, or they know everything, or whatever it is, and it'll be chaos.
Yeah, I think that I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think there's some cognitive biases, and I think that the cognitive biases are paired with some level of confirmation bias and also just a lack of understanding of the sources of knowledge. Mm-hmm. If you look at how knowledge is exponentially increased in the 21st century, it makes you realize that, okay, well, the common person, back, it's probably been several decades, but at one point, the common person could understand a cause and an effect. What happens, how to stop it, and that, I think that sort of understanding gave knowledge authorities more credibility in the eyes of the layperson. Mm-hmm. I think now those authorities, the knowledge and the tools needed to understand those knowledge are so far beyond the layperson that the layperson is starting to question whether or not they are truly legitimate. And the problem is that the layperson is unable to do the due diligence to fully understand it. Yeah. And so it basically comes down to, are you going to trust the knowledge authorities, or are you going to trust your own opinion of the way something goes?
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how little knowledge you have. It's always easier to trust yourself over anybody else than your own thing.
It is, but you just gave me an example to go with. Very few people among us act from a distrust of authority, engineering authority, mechanical authority, to the extent that they would feel that they needed to forge their own plastic and metal. First, they'd have to dig it up. They'd have to be able to be their own miners, and they'd be their own chemists in order to create a car. Their own, whether it's electric fuel based or oil based or whatever, their own development of, you'd have to have the authority of all of those things in order to put a car together. And that's just to drive down to the store. Oh, but there's an authority in that too, because after all, we trust that food sources are being more or less watched over. We assume so much. But because it's transparent, it no longer seems to be about an issue of authority because it's just there. But I think there's that disconnect again. I don't want to.
Right. And I think that the big problem is coming back to that sort of the confirmation bias there is if you choose to say that, knowledge authorities are wrong and that your own self-developed theories are right, as long as nothing goes wrong, you're going to continue to think that your theories are right. Even if those theories may be going right because of, like you said, the transparent infrastructure that knowledge authorities have put in place behind the systems that you utilize on a daily basis. So, the most common example that I hear of most often is flat earthers using their GPSs to get to places, right? It's like, okay, well, if the earth was flat, you wouldn't be able, your GPS wouldn't work, and all those different types of things, So yeah, there's this, I think it's the combination of those three things really, right? If you can't understand what's going on with the knowledge being created, and if you choose to believe something and for the most part it works out okay, then you really don't have any reason to go against something. Yeah. But then, there's plenty of stories of people whose kids didn't get vaccinated and then somebody dies, right? But as long as it's not your kid that dies, it was something else. There's a different.
I was just reading an article this week about this actually, because and partly I read it because of how enormously frustrating it is to have so many people flagrantly disregard knowledge. And the article writer, himself a philosopher, was saying, okay, well, we know that if there is such a thing as human nature, it is often unlikely to acknowledge anything until a personal event takes place. And the trouble with that is it's so remarkably slow. Oh, okay, I have a family member die of COVID. Maybe I ought to take this seriously. Or even then, there was a couple months back, there was a young man who was absolutely blown away, flabbergasted, because his parent had died of COVID, and he and others had been denying COVID's existence. And at the funeral, there were a large number of people in the family who refused to wear masks. And he got up at the funeral and said, what is it going to take for you to understand the truth of this? And I think that's a microcosmic example of how we all feel, and probably generations. But knowledge tells us that we may not have plentiful generations, as the planet itself is being devastated for a climate that is supportive of our kind of life. And so that slow learning is becoming increasingly deadly to the species.
Yeah. And, that's what I'm curious to see if that's going to happen over the next several decades, is as, climate disasters and stuff start getting worse, and more people are personally affected, if that will change the policy on how we address these sorts of things, what kind of authority we give to the opinions. Because that's the thing, is it's one thing for 97% of scientists to say that climate change is real, but if your life is continuing as normal, then people aren't going to think of it. But
if your life continues at normal, but then you're still finding yourself remarking about, I mean, I hear this daily. Wow, isn't it great? It's so nice to have it so warm. So, oh, wow, what temperatures these are. Okay, we have global warming. Look, no. Or we had really intensely cold days this winter. So, yeah, global warming, which means that people do not understand the science in the least. So even if it's normal, they're not processing And none of us does this. I'm not saying this from a holier than thou perspective. We're human. We refuse to accept some things. But the cumulative effect of that, and we're talking about authority. We need to anticipate that where you and I live right now, in Western New York, one of the most water-rich places on the planet, is going to have hundreds of thousands or more, perhaps millions of people who are displaced by environmental devastation, coming across into our borders to come to have water. How dare we tell them that they can't just because we're lucky enough to live? That's going to be a political authority set of decisions that is going to be remarkably powerful and politically life-changing.
Yeah, so let's get into that a little bit. The first question would be, do you need power to have authority?
No. I think not. And as I've read many different things over the years about the idea of authority, because it depends on what we mean by power. Ultimate power? No. This Death Star is the ultimate power in the galaxy. Wait, okay, no. This master's degree in teaching literature is not the ultimate power in the galaxy, but it's still an acknowledgement of an authority. Why do we have titles? A lot of people don't like titles. They don't like degrees, except that they think it'll get them a job. They don't think about necessarily what the degree means or give value to it. So many people say, let's just get through this education. Let's just get it behind us. What does that mean? It means I'm probably not paying attention to what I'm doing, but I'm going to do enough so that I'll do what they tell me to do so I can get this piece of paper or this digitized document. And it means nothing if you haven't accrued the authority. So a degree can be meaningless if you haven't done the work to earn the degree, because sometimes you're going to get a degree anyway, particularly in places that cater to the idea of the capitalistic exchange. You go sit in a chair, or you go sit in front of a Zoom screen, and you do it long enough, and we'll give you something. This is why the authority of really prestigious institutions, now I'm sounding elitist, because it is. Because elite learners, whether they're at a community college or whether they're at Harvard, are people who genuinely want to know things and are genuinely humble enough to realize that they can be wrong, to experiment, to explore, to build their knowledge across a lifetime, and to build their practice across a lifetime. You don't want a plumber who's doing the same thing that she or he or they did 25 years ago, necessarily, if there are new ways, methods, tools to address it. But that requires the authority of knowledge. Authority has no power, obviously, with segments of populations as a given, unless there's a force behind it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that you're absolutely right. The defining, what will define the answer to this question is how we determine what power is, right? Obviously, it seems pretty obvious that physical power isn't necessarily it. Based off of the first example I used in our intro, right? You see a little old person with a gigantic dog, right? The dog can tear him to shreds if it wanted to, but there's something else that's giving the person authority, and it may have been physical power at some point, right? Maybe the small dog was trained in such a way to be meek, and then once he grew too big to be controlled that way, there was still inside of his psychological, his cognitive processes that conditioning that said, okay, well, I have to act this certain way, despite the fact that the threat of the physical power is no longer there. So physical power, no, I don't think that physical power is necessary for authority. Um, but what other ways can we define power? That's where it gets interesting, right?
That's where it gets really. I'm sitting here because I'm an active grandpa, uh, and have been a parent, obviously. So there's this. I used this earlier with a different conversation we had, but this fluctuating osmotic border that is never absolutely pin downable when one has the authority of being a grandparent. I want my grandchild to understand danger. And, we talk about crosswalks and looking both ways and those kind of things. And there's a place at which you want the child to stop. If you need to, her, him, they, to stop, whatever it might be. But you don't, at the same time, at least I don't, want that child to always think that everything that I say is unquestionable, because that's ridiculous. And so I want the child to push back, but to push back in civil ways. And when you're working with a young soul, that's not always going to happen, right? So it is very, again, in microcosm, that kind of relationship of parental or grandparental authority is something that can be abused, wielded like a jackhammer, without reflection, or it can be nurtured as, yes, I know some things, I don't know everything. This is why this is important. Stop. But this is why we need to talk about X, Y, or Z. However nascent that very young conversation might be. So there's a power when people accept that the power exists. And the power is a complete illusion if people don't accept it.
Yeah, so we have authority, power, and I think the linchpin here is relationships, right?
Yeah.
There's no need for authority if there's no relationships. So you have relationships, you have authority, and then power is how it plays into it really varies depending on what kind of authority or what kind of relationship there is. And, so in your relationship with your granddaughter, she has power of a different kind, right?
Oh, yes.
She has the power to be cute, and she probably knows how to be manipulative in this sort of way to gain some sort of
all
power
young
in the
ones
relationship.
learn to gain that, yes.
All right,
yes.
Right. So does that give her any kind of authority, or does she just have a power in the relationship?
She has the authority of seeing the world in a new way. And when I'm at my best, I acknowledge that, because that's part of the joy of all of this. She will see things that cause me to then talk with her about them. And that can be mundane things. It can be because the senses are so acute. We can be walking to the park and I can hear and I'm listening to the things, and she'll say, "What's that noise?" Well, we have bird song, we have hammering going on with people repairing a house, we have trucks and so on. And so I'll go through the litany of, here's what I'm hearing. No. There's something else. And then she'll point, it'll happen again. And you'll say, oh, that's water running underneath the road. And we're near a grating in the highway. And this is where water runs that comes out of the hills. So it's not all over the street. But a sound that I would take as just so transparent that I don't even acknowledge it. So she has the authority of freshly experiencing something. All kids do, if they're nurtured in this, to say, no, not that, this.
Right.
Tell me about this.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you're honest, you can say, well, this is what I know about this. We can find out more. Then you're ceding that authority that you have, not pretending that it's bigger than it ought to be, and pointing toward, let's go seek knowledge together. I know that sounds utopian. It's not always utopian, but that's
no, and I think that there's definitely something to look at there. I think some people might say, oh, okay, well, I I failed to see the authority there, but I kind of see it as a creative person. I think that kids are kind of creative authorities.
Yes.
Because, and I think that comes back to biology, right? If you look at developmental psychology and stuff, how the brain grows, they have so many neurons and stuff. And basically they can take a stimulus, and rather than adults who have, our neural pathways that are well trod, myelinated,
deep as the gorges of any park.
So we know how to connect A to B, and there's a value in that. There's a speed, there's an authority in how we interpret information.
Yes.
But for kids to have a stimulus and then to be able to interpret it in any number of different ways, it allows them to see the world in a completely different way than is possible for us. And I think that as a creative person, that's something that you can learn from. You can cede authority to that and think, okay, well, if I'm going to write this song or paint this picture or write this story,
yes,
it would probably be better for it if I were to attempt to do it through the mind of a child than if I were to try to do it through the mind of, an adult.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you start thinking about emulating the masters in these different arts, you start to think, well, these people are probably closer to doing it as a child than they are, than they are as an adult. So I think that you're right. I think there is some kind of authority there. But I think I still want to think about that question a little bit more, that where power plays into this, right? So we can see that, all right, I guess a child could have authority in certain aspects of a relationship. Does a child have power in the relationship? Like we were talking about, if a kid knows to be cute in order to get what they want from a parent, is that a power without authority, or is there still an authoritative?
Well, that's the authority of intuited, even though they wouldn't be able to use the vocabulary because they don't have intuited psychological behavioral training. There's that, but I think there's something else. A child ought. That's me, ought. I shouldn't be saying ought because it sounds moralistic. For me, a child needs to have the authority of things such as, let's do a random example. Let's say that adults always like to tickle kids' feet or under the neck or something. If a child says to you, "Don't do that," and the adult keeps doing it, that child has the authority to say, "No, I don't like that." And if an adult continues to say, "Well, you ought to like it because everybody likes that," then the adult is overstepping. You like it. Well, I can't help but think of this the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeers. This goes back a ways, right? But there's the authority of Santa Claus saying you can't be in my team if you have an aberrant nose. There's the dad saying, "I'm going to cover up your nose. You'll wear this covering and you'll like it." No. Sorry, no, that doesn't make any sense. And I think part of even though it's egregious in some ways, the lesson in that little piece of pop cultural fluff that keeps living is that even Santa Claus can be wrong, especially a Santa Claus who has the authoritarian. He has elves on his sleigh dropping presents. He doesn't even go down the chimney. He's got this whole imperialistic. I'm getting off on a track. Anyway. Yes, I think children have the authority of understanding what is comfortable to them. Now, they don't have the authority of saying, "No, I won't eat." Well, they do. You cannot force somebody to eat. Now, they may eat at different times than you do. That may not be convenient, and so you put the food before them. But I think if you say to them, "And you're not going to have any other food because you're going to eat when I tell you to," that can assert an authority that is not necessarily true to a biological system. So all of these things are complicated.
Yeah, so I guess what we're still trying to suss out is if you need power to have authority, or if they can exist independently.
Well, what do we mean by, what do you think power means?
Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out, right? So, like we were saying before, if a child is manipulative of an adult, are they just asserting the power that they have of being cute or being, whatever, to get something, or is there an authority in there?
No, adults do the same thing. We are inveterately do this. Relationships are so often transactional without us even necessarily thinking about them. And transaction implies power. You have something I want, I'll give you this, you give me that. Whether it's in a marriage or it's in a friend relationship or it's in a work relationship, we are so trained into the transactional that I think that the power, what's power? Power is being able to influence somebody else, either to force them to do something you want or to coerce them into doing something you want, or to force a course toward a better overall.
Okay. So
structure.
okay. Now we're getting somewhere.
Yeah.
So the key word there was influence, right?
Yeah.
So you need, you have influence. Can you have authority without influence? So, and I think that the example that we were talking about earlier in the show is interesting, right? We're talking about scientific authority, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how scientific authority is being eroded because of a lack of influence, pretty much, right? They're unable to influence people. Now, they still have authority. They have knowledge authority.
The influence is being eroded.
But yeah, the influence is being eroded. So what is the relationship there? If the influence is completely eroded and nobody is paying any attention to science, period, do they still have an authority or do they just have a knowledge?
Well, they have an authority as long as there's another scientist who acknowledges this learning. There's another surgeon who says, yes, there's another anatomist who says, yeah, there are 204 bones in the human body.
So as long as there's relationships.
Yes.
If there's relationships that have influence, there's authority.
Yeah, I would take that as a working definition.
All right, it took us a while to get there. I think we answered some questions. So that leads into our next question, which would be how do we legitimize authority?
Oh, well, let's take the word legitimize. If we mean normalize, which I don't think is the intent, but if there's a situation in which the expectation is that one will not push back, even though one conceivably could, but really no, one's not going to push back, then that's a normalization of an imbalance of power. That's an authoritarian regime, which then concocts its own, this is really how reality is, just because I say it is. That's a normalization of the abnormal. Legitimacy implies that a system functions, not perfectly, and that it can be improved. But normalization is different because you can have bizarre things become.
Yeah, a really good example of this is like your consent agreements, right? So, you download an update for your phone and they give you a 17-page
and
thing
whoever reads that
in 6-point font, single spaced, and so everybody without exception, except, okay, maybe there's some lawyers out there that read through the whole thing, but almost everybody just scrolls to the bottom, hits accept, and downloads their update.
Why does everybody do that?
Right. And so here's where we go with legitimized authority, right? And this has been a big topic of it in philosophy, is your de facto authority, your tacit consent, all of your different things.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there was some questions. This was specifically an issue of debate a couple of years ago. It kind of hit the news pretty big, where people were saying that, well, this isn't legitimate because your average person who's downloading an update for their phone doesn't have the time to read it, and even if they did, couldn't understand the legalese. So you can't possibly hold them accountable for agreeing to this, despite the fact that they did agree to it. So where does that fall? Is that legitimate authority or not? Do you think if you provided people with the information, even if they couldn't interpret it or didn't have the time, but you put a big button at the bottom that said agree and they hit the button that said agree, is it a legitimate authority?
Yes, because we have the agency to say no. And if we say no, then we don't get what we want. And so we say yes, because blasted, I want that new that new app or whatever it happens to be. So we cede our power for the transactional, momentary or extended happiness of whatever that thing is to which we have agreed. But in fact, it's legitimate because we say, well, we have no choice. We have to have this. No, you don't. Right? You really don't.
So yeah, let's do a theoretical then, hypothetical. Let's say you did need it. Let's say it was food, right? Okay. Let's say it was food, right? So we have an authoritative government. There's a food shortage. They're distributing food.
Yep.
You have to sign a extremely long legal agreement that you don't have time to read, you can't understand, but if you say yes to it, they give you food.
Mm-hmm.
And this contract can include any sort of egregious
violation of any privacy or
terms that you might imagine, right?
Yeah.
So is that a legitimate authority? If it's necessary for survival and they put you through these hoops?
Well, it's an aberrant normalcy that makes it necessary for survival. I would say that it's not legitimate in any moral sense because it is a life and death situation. And I think there are a lot of illegitimacies that are implied in that model. This goes back to Orwell, where the form of torture is, tell me how many fingers I'm holding up, and if you don't tell me the right number of fingers after a certain amount of training, then you're going to die. If somebody holds up 5 fingers and says how many, and they want you to say 4, you eventually say 4 because you actually think that you see 4. You've convinced yourself of their reality. And torture is illegitimate,
right.
As far as I'm concerned. So yes, I think that is. But I think it is, yes, the will to survive so that you can now survive, so your kids can survive, and maybe they can overthrow this awful government. Okay. In this what ifs that we're doing.
Right. So, and this is demonstrable scientifically. They've found that people who lie a lot start to believe their lies.
Mm-hmm.
So you can manipulate people in this sort of way. And like you were saying, I think that again we're bringing that triangulation of authority, relationships, and power. And I think what we're talking about here is a relationship with authority where all of the power is on one end. So is it the distribution of power that makes a legitimate authority? Do you have to have some distribution of power in order for the authority to be legitimate?
It depends on the kind of, well, okay. I have to, for me personally, is one thing. For all of us, we're talking the grand scheme. The church, for a long, long time, assumed and projected and demanded the authority of the theological above all else. To the punitive point of, if you didn't accept this, then we lock you out of heaven. Because, okay, I don't find that legitimate. I think that's ridiculous. But there was certainly the power. So you're ask it again.
All right, so I'll ask 2 questions because I think that you really need to answer the 2. So when we're thinking about a legitimate authority, and then we're thinking about the other 2 legs that we talked about earlier in the show, if all of the power is in one side of the relationship,
mm-hmm.
is it possible to have legitimate authority? Or conversely, does the type of relationship determine whether a authority is legitimate regardless of the power distribution?
The type of authority is important, But if the power distribution is all in one group, exclusive of any other authoritative view, you have to assert that. In other words, nobody, well, that's not true. People want all Democrats to be in charge, or they want all Republicans to be in charge. They can't conscience the idea of somebody not Republican having power, or not Democrat having power. Even though being Democrat or Republican means a whole lot of things along an entire spectrum, from the absolutely egregious to the totally socially responsible. So you can have legitimacy of the authority of knowledge in groups, and you might stumble on one person having enough, but I can't imagine that. That's why an authoritarian regime doesn't work. I have the way, I know, and I've gathered up and consolidated all the military and everything else, so this is how we're going to do it, because I just know that this is right. No human being knows everything. And so I think the very notion of that is illegitimate, which is why we don't generally support authoritarian regimes, although we come close sometimes.
Yeah, so this has really important implications. I have so many things coming through my head right now.
No,
right?
Me too.
So we're thinking about, okay, so if we're considering a relationship to have illegitimate authority, if all of the power is on one side, that really challenges some of our social institutions. Now, some of them, like, let's say a teacher in a class.
Okay.
That one's not technically true, right? Because the teacher's never going to have complete power. But you can see along that spectrum, in some classes, a teacher may be much more authoritative than a class. And so the more power a teacher holds, it changes how you view authority in the class. But let's take a different example, because I think this one is going to be the very difficult one, right?
Okay.
The American prison system.
Mm-hmm.
So one actor in this relationship has all of the power. But is that still a legitimate authority? And so I think the interesting philosophical question this raises, right, is you look at European criminal justice systems and these sorts of things, and they're much more based around reform, and as a prison system should be, which gives the prisoner the power to choose how they're rehabilitating themselves to some extent. There's obviously some, compunctual, there's things you have to do. But there is some choice you have in the matter of how you're going to reform yourself. In the American prison system, you don't have that. You're thrown away. You're locked up. For the most part, in about 89% of situations, it's a specific number because that's what we have for maximum security prisons. Minimum, medium security prisons, you have much more freedom, much more choice. But maximum security, which is the overwhelming proportion of prison systems, you're locked away for a number of years and you have no power. So is that a legitimate authority?
I don't think so. It's been legitimated by practice. I mean, our prison system is a devastation. That's me thinking that. I'm not representing anybody on that. We know that our prison system has disproportionately targeted the BIPOC community, blacks, Hispanics, Latinx. We know this. We can't ignore this. And when a prison system becomes a capitalistic priority, as in, how dare you remove a prison from our community? You're going to take away all of our jobs. Well, if all of your jobs in your community are based on how many people we can lock up, then we are ill. We have lost our way. And so, no, I do not find it in any ethical or moral sense legitimate. Has it been legitimized by legislation? Yep. But that's why it needs to be severely questioned.
And this is the importance of philosophy, right?
Yeah.
We've gone through these steps trying to suss out what authority is and what its relationship is with power, what its relationship is with legitimacy. And all of a sudden you start to examine the sorts of things you take for granted, and you come to some conclusions that you might not have if you didn't think about it a certain way. So yeah, that's, it's a wild thing to think about, that an institution like our criminal justice system, which many people have so much reverence for, it's a very good chance it might not actually be legitimate, depending on how you're defining authority.
Yeah.
So how do we balance freedom and authority? How do we, whether it's criminal justice or politics as a whole,
teachers in a classroom or whatever it is,
right? A child and a parent. How do you balance these things?
Idealistically, you acknowledge when you try to be at your best, and when you're at your best, you acknowledge that you don't have the sources of all knowledge, you don't have the authority of all knowledge, and you can't just say, "Well, why is the sky blue, Daddy?" Because that's just not a legitimate answer. Now, I mean, you may be worn out and tired and okay, but if you never revisit that, you've done a disservice to that child. The balance is in the inductive taking in of observation, the acknowledgement of what is known and what comes to be known and how that could and ought to change policies. And never to assume that your side or your own views are always right. I mean, it's not that difficult, and yet it's the most difficult thing in the world for people. It shouldn't be that difficult, but it is.
Right. What's interesting about that is, the original question is balancing freedom and authority.
Oh, well.
And what you just described was essentially people taking away their own freedom. People like to subscribe to an authority so that and that authority may take away their freedoms of choice or their power in choosing how they want to do things in order to toe a party line or toe, whatever the relationship is,
Well, okay, so Rousseau talked about the social contract. We've touched on that before. The social contract is still an idea in which you're talking about. What does the state owe you? What do you owe the state? I think we did a pretty robust discussion of that in one of our sessions, which is, it's not nothing that we talked about is a one-time thing. We can go back to any of them and keep coming to new places. But if one accepts that the state is necessary and that personal freedom is necessary, then one needs to accept that all the things that you think that you want to assert that everybody ought to do because you think it is absolute, that has to be discussed. That has to be poked and prodded, and not out of just intuitive feeling, but out of knowledge as it exists. And the question always should be, for the power balance, is what do I want? Do I think that I want everybody to do that is really not necessary in order to have a good life? What behaviors do people have that I don't necessarily want to do, but really it shouldn't bother me? That's their choice. And we're losing that idea of choice. We're also losing the idea of acknowledging that the world is more complex than we want it to be. There's a push toward no gray areas is part of, I think, the problem of diminishing the influence of authority in the classroom, which I can speak to with some authority. There's the authority and there's the authoritative. Authoritarian classrooms are one in which the teacher always asserts that I'm right, you will do this and do that, and you have an ideological training in a school system that says this is the way, this is the only way, you cannot question back, you cannot take another way, you will all say this pledge in this certain way or whatever it happens to be. No questioning. That's devastating to the idea of exploration, inductive learning, and developing authority. Anyone who never questions is not being a human being. We have to push back. Teachers should want students to push back, not in ways that are, I'm not talking about pushback as in, oh, I want to threaten you because I can, because I'm an American, I can threaten. No, stop it. I wonder why, where does that come from? Why do people think this? Can I ask that question? Yes. And here's some possibilities, but we don't know for sure why people think this. On the other hand, this has been experimented with and demonstrated over and over again. It's a law of physics. Well, can a law of physics be broken? Probably, but it hasn't been yet. And so as far as we know, this is how gravity works. That kind of exchange, rather than everybody be quiet, write down, gravity works.
Right.
I think there are many teachers who do try to teach that Socratic way, who do encourage the positive pushback. But systems tend to become ponderous. And you have codes of behavior that get thicker and thicker and thicker, whether it's at colleges or high schools or wherever it is. And then we have homeschooling. And there are families that are that put together pods where people in those families have different kinds of knowledges that they develop. But unless you are a pod of people who have access to scientific knowledge and you acknowledge that scientific knowledge or medical or whatever happens to be, you don't have an equal education going on.
Right. Yeah. And, the American political system is just kind of the easiest example with a lot of this stuff, right? I think that you really hit it where as time has gone on, things have gotten more and more complex and bigger. And I think that a lot of people are just like, well, let's just go back to what the Constitution said, what the founding fathers said. But those guys got in trouble, right? Because, up until the Bill of Rights, they had no way of collecting any money or taxes, and the country almost disappeared because they couldn't defend themselves. So, there's a constant growth, right? You start out with something, and then your authority and your knowledge and your relationships and your influence and your power all change, and you develop new knowledge is integrated out of those interactions.
Ideally.
Right.
But marvelous philosopher, humanitarian Hannah Arendt, one of the things that she said quite some time ago was that, and we've done a session on this one too, nostalgia is what gets in the way of that very progress that you're talking about. That she essentially said that if you start any kind of system and you just decide that, well, we can ignore the bad that happened. That's just detritus. We've made progress and so on. You are not going to have a system that is sustainable and healthy. That you have to go back and look at the awfulness, and not just look at it, but to say, what are we going to do to really address that in order to make all of us have the possibility of a really relationships again, of equitable, honest relationships. But you can't just have the nostalgia that says, well, yeah, we've been great from the get-go, but we got better. Oh, did we? Did we never do anything wrong? Has progress always just been happening? And authority of knowledge tells us, no, of course not.
Yeah, and and you fight biology to do that, because your brain is wired in such a way where if you've survived, your brain says, okay, well, past experiences are good because you've survived, and you should be scared of anything new because you haven't tried to do that and it could kill you. So, people want to continue to do things the same old way. But yeah, you can see there's obviously ways that can backfire on you. Like like you were saying, if you pass school, but you with a 2.1 GPA and then you want to go to college, but you don't want to look at any of your failed classes because that's in the past, or whatever, then it's not going to work out for you.
And conversely, if a system, because this happens, and even if it was sometimes best intent, if a system is constructed such that the practitioners within it will identify a child by some behavior, characterize that child by that behavior at that moment, and thereby determine what they think is the entire future of that child. Causing the child to live down to those negative expectations, then there's great damage that's done that doesn't need to be done. And so authority, there can be a false authority. I know what you're going to be like because I see who you are. Oh, really? So when you were a kid, are you the same person that you are now?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
I never made any mistakes at all, did I? That's why you can follow me as a great moral example. That's crap. and yet we do that. We pretend. That's pretend knowledge. And true authoritative, not authoritarian, authoritative knowledge says, do we know that psychologically? Of course we don't know that. And what do we know about best ways to help a child? And some go bad. Some human beings go bad. But not the numbers that we like to pretend do all that as if it's just somehow going to automatically happen. No, we make it happen.
Right. Yeah, and I think that you're pointing out exactly what we talked about. If you judge a child, or you diagnose a child at a snapshot in time, you're not taking into account the relationships that are changing, the influences that are changing, the knowledge that's changing, all those different things. So yeah, what we've discovered is that authority is very complex. There's a bunch of different things that play into it, and that those things are constantly evolving. And how we view it is something that we have to re-examine regularly. All right, this has been a great episode. Thanks for being back in the studio, Norm. And
glad to be here.
We'll talk again soon. Until next time, keep pondering.